Everyone in history had a concept of emptiness or nothingness, which is why so many places talk about a void before time. But the number zero as a concept started in the Americas for the Americas, and it started in India for the East and the West and the South, if you want to consider Africa part of the West or East, I don't know. This concept that started in India got shipped to Africa in Egypt and was transformed under the Islamic Golden Age. And then it got transferred to the West and it was transformed once again. But what was the difference between the zero in the Indian Islamic and Western concept and the one used by the Native Americans? Is it true that the Native Americans really had a mathematical system 1000 BC that matched our own? Or was it better? For thousands of years, people had a base 10 system, which is counting from 1 to 10 on your fingers. This is seen throughout Africa, Europe, even the Americas, and Asia. But some places had different bases. For example, the Americans had a base 20 system. And the reason for this is probably because they count both their fingers and their toes. This makes their mathematics a little different than that of the Eastern, or what they call Indian Arabic numerals, which is the numerals we use today. Looking at these numbers, you can tell that the Mesoamerican one still stuck with simple dots, which probably represent a stone for counting. Each dot is representing the actual number of things rather than a symbolic form until you get to five. If you notice, five is a big straight line representing, which is equal to the length of four. But then it's supposed to represent five and six and seven and eight and nine. And this is interesting because you can start noticing certain patterns, which is all mathematics is. And you notice on 10, 20, 15, all the way you start jumping to the hundreds. When it comes to 20, we notice that you put this symbol that represents a dot and zero. This dot and zero represents 20. A dot and a dot represents 21. So you can tell that the dot represents 20, but that zero is in that place to represent that there is nothing else besides this 20. And you can see that this zero has a real property as opposed to, the other systems where the number zero is a general concept. And you can see over there that if you look at the number 28, right, you got that dot, you got 1, 2, 3, and then you have that line, 28. So this dot is actually 20, which it's not one. It's not one, it's 20. Then when you get down to the bottom, you go back to the simple system where it's 3 plus 5, which equals 8. 28. Now, this might seem like fun and games, like, oh, they're just calculating numbers. But what about practical matters, like a calendar? Because the calendar of the Mesoamericans did not utilize or did not use the same system as the Gregorian or the Roman calendars or other calendars from around the world that didn't have the number zero, it had an advantage. Today, it seems obvious that when you're born, you're 0 years old. But this is a consequence of the Hindu Arabic alphabets or numerals. And the reason for this is because it's easier to use when you're counting your own birthday. And you can see that the Mesoamericans did the same thing. So when you were born, you were 0 years old, and just like their calendar starts as 0 years old, and when you die, you're whatever your age would be. The next year, let's say you're one, you become one after a year. So it corresponds perfectly with a year. Now, other calendars were a little different, like the Roman calendar, which starts at let's look at it for a second. We say the Roman calendar will be 1 BC, and then after that will be 1 AD. It won't be zero. It's not 1 BC, then zero, then 1 AD. It's just 1 BC, then 1 AD. This causes a lot of complications, and in the future, you start to get leap years and all this other stuff to try and make up for the mathematics. Whereas the Mayan calendar or the Mesoamerican calendars do not have this problem. Now you're wondering why I keep saying Mesoamerican calendar. It's because the number zero was probably invented by the Olmec and then adopted by the Mayans. And then when the Mayans abandoned their civilization and started another civilization, they had the numbers over there. What you could do with numbers after the number zero was introduced was just staggering, which is why it's so important. It's not a small number. Now let's talk about the number zero and infinity. Zero and infinity seem to be the same number in some respects. For example, infinity times any positive number remains infinity, and zero times by any number is zero. This is worse when you consider the fact that what will happen if we put infinity against zero? This is how powerful zero is. Zero times infinity equals zero. As a number, zero is very important and it cannot be shoved to the side. It is the most important number out there. Another way that zero and infinity are similar is that if you had zero in your bank, you would basically have the same number if you had infinite, because your money would be so devalued that it would be worthless. It's the same as if we use sand as money. At some point, you just go, no, I can't take that. And your money system would collapse instantly. This made a religious justification for the Mayans of how something can come from nothing, how you can start with a world of void and end up with everything in the world if infinity and zero are mathematically the same and provable. Now, to say this in a different way using modern concepts, let's go back to hominins in back in the day. Back in the day, people used to believe that nature. So everybody looked around and said, "What creates?" And they were like, "Okay, the world creates." So they assumed the world to have infinite power, and if it has infinite power, it can create the stars and everything, the trees, people. But it turns out that this concept was just flawed or incorrect. But later on, humans gave other types of humans, which they might have made up, called gods, infinite power. And of course, if you give them infinite power, it is possible for them to create the entire world. The problem is, do they exist? Now, in our modern day, we do the same thing. We say, what creates? And we say, computers create. Well, what happens if you give a computer infinite power? Well, surely it could create the whole world, the whole universe. The problem is, do you have any proof for an infinite computer? And also, what is the difference between a computer with infinite power and a human with infinite power? The differences would simply be semantical. To make matters worse, our universe does not seem to have infinite power. It seems like our power is finite, our energy is finite. So, a computer that would reach infinite power is, especially one made by humans, would practically be impossible. For those who don't understand, some people believe that humans can create a computer so powerful that we can simulate a reality. And within that reality, the other people can simulate another reality. And within that reality, those people can simulate. And then after a while, with so many realities, if you check in the line, it would be impossible to tell whether you were in the beginning or the end of the simulation because it would be an infinite line of simulations. The problem with this is that we don't have infinite power, and so we would have to be either the end of that simulation or that simulation line just simply doesn't exist. To me, it's just a modern version of religion. Not saying that religion is fake, just saying it's a modern version of it. Same concept, different articulation and usage.